We wanted to do something that's specifically related to Iowa, and I'm afraid I screwed up here. Bear with me for a minute. I need to get my PowerPoint accessible here. All right, bear with me for a minute here, please.
While he's working on this, I want to just mention that Reverend Larry Stummy is a former attorney for county attorney for Bremer County, not Blackhawk. So we wanted to be correct about that. And I work with Larry in various capacities, including the Cedar Valley Interfaith Coalition, because I mean, he's one of these people with different hats. He's an attorney, he's been a prosecuting attorney, he is now also a religious leader, faith leader at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Cedar Falls. So just wanted to get that story straight while Al is putting together.
Yeah, I've got it now.
Okay.
Yeah, and we also have Aaron Hobaker on our panel. Many of you already know Aaron because he's been a good ally for IJN for quite some time. But he's the head of the Waterloo Adult Public Defender's Office. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through a quick PowerPoint that gives some overall picture of incarceration in Iowa, and then I'm going to ask these guys to comment on it, and also kind of from the point of view of how this developed, and so let me get my screen share up here. Let's see now. All right, I think I've got this squared away now. All right, just an overview of massive incarceration in Iowa, and some of the data are a little hard to come by on the state level, but we can use it as of September 2022. There were 8,222 people in Iowa state prisons, and the Prison Population Initiative estimates an additional 4,300 in jails, although of course the jail numbers change daily, so it's sometimes hard to track that. The Prison Policy Initiative also estimates that there are about 3,700 Iowans that are serving sentences in federal prisons. So, and then an additional 36,000 are under correctional control, as we call it, through either probation or parole. So there are many, many thousands of Iowans that are currently involved in the system. Our per capita incarceration rates are slightly lower than the national average, not much lower, 528 versus 572. I think Alex got a lower figure, but that's only state prisons. This is total overall incarceration rate. But of course, as many of you know, Iowa has one of the largest racial disparities in incarceration. In 2022, Blacks represented 26.1% of the adult prison population versus 3% of the population. That's Black, and The Latinx disparity, well, the Black disparity is 9-to-1. The Latinx disparity is about 2-to-1. And there's really only a few other states in the country that have this large of racial disparity. Minnesota is one of them that also has a huge racial disparity. But of course, this shows, greatly the inequity of our system. Now, of course, the starting point of this is a conviction, okay? And not everybody that's convicted, of course, ends up in prison, but obviously the convictions are the source of people for many people eventually coming to prison. And these are some data that were compiled by some students and Dr. Belinda Clayton Smith's class that really helped me out last semester. And this is derived from the Criminal and Juvenile Justice Planning Agency that's part of the Iowa Department of Human Rights, which has incredibly detailed data on both arrests and convictions across Iowa. And if you look at felony convictions between 2014 and 2021, you see that, and this applies to all 8 urban counties in Iowa, okay? Not just Blackhawk, but you can see that across the board in every urban county, anywhere from 20 to 30% of anywhere from 15 to 35% of people that are convicted are Black, and about so, and then you look at the population down below the other line that's in red, and you see that the percentage of people convicted is much larger than the percentage of the population that is in that racial category. And so, and you can see that the disparities vary between counties, but they're consistently, the Black proportion is consistently a multiple of the Black proportion that's the population. So you can see from this where our the origins of our imprisonment disparity starts here. Then we also did misdemeanors, because of course rarely do people go to prison for misdemeanors, but obviously they're kind of the front door to the system. People that are convicted of a misdemeanor often leads to deeper involvement in the criminal justice system in the future. And you can see also that the misdemeanor arrests are disproportionately people of color. So this gives you a sense of what's going on kind of at the input part of the system, which results in people ending up in prison. In 1973, there were less than 2,000 people in Iowa State Prison. But of course, Iowa followed the national trend of rapid increases in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so during the past 10 years, the prison population has fluctuated roughly between 8,000 and 8,500, except for a drop during the 2 pandemic years, which was due to several causes, which we can get into. And so that because of the absence of significant reform, imprisonment has not dropped that as it has in other states that have implemented reform. And this is a national chart from the Sentencing Project that shows the incarceration trends, and you can see that it's after 2010, the national population stopped increasing and started to decrease. Now, 2021, those numbers are affected by the pandemic, so probably we'll see in 2022 that they'll uptick again. But so you see the national trend has been downward, whereas Iowa has stayed basically the same, in the same range over those last few years. Arlene, did you have a question?
Yeah, Al, if you can go back on, I think 2 slides where you showed the percentage of yeah, that one. I was a little bit unclear in the percentage of blacks from 2014 to 2021. It looks like to me that that percentage is higher, but even though we had decreased felonies, so I'm not really clear what I'm looking at here, or was it maybe it was the misdemeanors, not the felonies. I'm sorry. Yeah, because it was like 37 point something percent. It caught my eye because, yeah, because in 2014 it's 36, but it's went up in 2021. But it looked like the misdemeanors actually in Blackhawk went down on
Well,
both. So
yeah,
I didn't understand that.
well, and I think, and maybe maybe Aaron can comment on why misdemeanor convictions would go down, but it shows that even when you can reduce the overall level of convictions, that it's still people of color are going to be, you know, overrepresented in the remaining population of convictions. I'm glad you caught that, Arlene. That even though the overall numbers have decreased, the disproportionality has actually increased in most of the counties that you look at. If you look at those numbers down there, and I know it's hard to absorb a chart like this on a PowerPoint, but I'll be glad to share these data with and you can go into CJJP and get data on any combination of things you want. I would like to break this down sometime to the source of the convictions, drugs, and so forth, and look at it in more detail. But this is just an overall view. But you can, if you're a person that likes to crunch numbers, they've got lots of numbers for you to crunch in there if you really want to.
That's right. Thank you.
So the interesting thing, and it seems contradictory at first, but if you think about it, the number of people admitted to prison has dropped fairly significantly over the last 10 years in Iowa, prison admissions. And this applies to virtually all classes of felony, except for violent offenses and sexual offenses, which have been a lot more admission for sexual offenses in recent years. But, and you ask, well, if the admissions have dropped, how come the population has stayed the same or virtually the same? Well, I think a good part of that is because of the length of sentences. Because if you looked at, even though the admissions have dropped, there's been a significant increase in the average length of stay. So 18% for Class B, which is the most serious class other than A, which is homicide. The length of sentence is life without parole for murder. So you're not going to see that's going to be always what it is. But for Class B, which is the next level of seriousness, an 18% increase in length of sentences. Class C, 19%, and Class D, a significant increase in the length of sentences for these so-called minor offenses. So if the length of sentences are increasing, then you can see how the population could stay the same, even if you're seeing a drop in admissions. So just a breakdown on the type of felonies for which people are being admitted. 35.6 for felonies involving violence. 25.7 are for property crimes. 20.7% are drug offenses, and meth is the most common one. 15% for public order, and less than 1% for other offenses. Sorry for the misspelling there. Anyway, so just a brief note on my data sources here. As I mentioned, criminal and juvenile justice planning has a wealth of data, both on the prison population and on the the people that are being arrested and convicted. They have a file. You can click on a button called Easy Access to Adult and Juvenile Data and get just about anything you want on. They also have they have arrests as well as convictions. Then some of my data are from a group called the Prison Population Initiative, which does break down incarceration by state. They show slightly higher numbers of incarcerated than our data show from CJJP and the DLC, but they can give you a breakdown on things like the jail population that we really don't have much local data on. And then, of course, the Sentencing Project has some state breakdowns if you're interested. So that's my kind of quick overview. And again, you can contact me for more detailed information, or go out and get it yourself if you want. So let me ask first. Let me ask Aaron to start off commenting on these trends and what he's seen as contributors to these, and what he sees as the picture we're facing right now. So go ahead, Aaron.
We don't have enough time for that, Al. No. Well, first of all, I saw that Rachel Antonuccio is on the call, and I apologize. I had some issues. We have new computers, and I didn't have the Zoom client in there, and evidently the client works a lot better than the web-based one, and so I fixed that problem now. But if you don't know Rachel, she's my companion on the juvenile side. She runs the Waterloo Juvenile Office, and much thanks to her, she's a transplant from Johnson County, and she's been the champion of diversion programs related to drugs and most recently driving. So my claps to Rachel, and we're happy to have her in town. Second, in regard to my opinion about the trends, Al, I'm going to disagree with the idea that you start with convictions. That's not really true. To me, you start with the arrests, and that explains in large part the beginning of the disparity and the racial makeup of people in the criminal justice system. I can get into the over-policing of certain neighborhoods, but it also explains why the prosecutor's decision not to prosecute marijuana charges really is not going to have that substantial an effect until it's legalized. And the reason is then it can still be used as a basis to stop and search individuals and to uncover maybe possibly other minor crimes and things like that. And so it's still a very aggressive tool that's used by law enforcement to bring people into the criminal justice system. So while I applaud the effort and I like it, and diversion programs are necessary until such times that it's legalized, law enforcement is still going to be able to use it to interfere with people's lives. Arlene, just real quick, I wanted to address the misdemeanor disparity you saw there. And I agree with Al that it shows obviously the disparity got worse. We had fewer misdemeanors, and yet the disparity grew, which means it's a worse problem. But the other thing is, I don't think that the fluctuations over the course of that 8 years was all that significant, a few hundred here or there, because the reality is that we end up, I think Blackhawk County on averages arrests 600-700 people a month. And I see the majority of those complaints. So that fluctuation that I see there, if the data from 2020-21, excuse me, maybe it was reflective in COVID because there's less likely to have police interaction at that time. I don't know, but not significant except for the fact that the disparity jumps out at you, right? So as far as the trends are concerned, well, we just have harsher sentences. And one of the things that I look at in that increase in jails, increase in the prison population, and now I think you pointed out that people are doing the longer sentences, is that there's a certain type of sentence, we call them 70 percenters. They used to be called 85 percenters. But you don't get substantial good time reduction. And so the mandatories that are applied to them are beefy. So robbery second, sex abuse second, murder second, robbery first, those types of things, they'll have a 17.5-year mandatory, or one murder second, a 35-year mandatory, and people have to do the lion's share of that time, in contrast to other mandatories where they get 1.2 days off of that. So if you look at the prison population, and the Department of Corrections, who in control of the prisons, as distinct from the Department of Correctional Services that do community-based corrections. The prison population, the reason it keeps ramping up is because those people that are in there on those 25-year sentence with 17.5-year mandatories, they'll see a lot of D felonies, the 5-year sentences with no mandatory. C felonies, they might have a mandatory, but it's 18 months. Those people are in and out of the system relatively quickly. But, you know, for every 10 that are in and out, they add one of those Class B felonies and they're there forever. And so you see that line that keeps going up. So that trend in increased incarceration is, and they keep tacking on and adding, by the way, to those types of offenses every year. And right now I'm part of the Iowa Association for Justice, which used to be called the Iowa Trial Lawyers Association, but that name became in disfavor. So we had to give ourselves a more polite name. And the core group on the criminal side that kind of tracks the legislation that comes through. And last year they did it, and there were some efforts to do it this year, where they'll add to those types of crimes that have those beefier minimums, which means people will spend more time in prison, even though last year the same crime wouldn't carry that penalty. And that's because some legislature somewhere had something happen to a family. You know, it's all a knee-jerk reaction to problems. But that's the biggest problem, is that we have lengthier sentences and no discretion for the court, by the way. And I understand that motivation. You know, I mean, I see some people that I see compared to people, clients in my, that I see that get some favorable treatment. And so the mandatory minimums, you want to try to get rid of that favorable treatment. But the judges are under the microscope for the most part anymore. I don't think we have to worry about that anymore. And frankly, if there's favorable treatment that's going to happen, it's going to happen at the charging level, not necessarily at the judicial level from the county attorney's perspective. So I guess I wish that there was more discretion with the courts with a lot of these sentences. And I did see in the video that, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her name, but the person from the Sentencing Project, you'll notice how I think they were talking to jurors in a case where they said, if we'd have known. And boy, that is so common. That is so common. I mean, a jury will hear the facts of the case and they'll convict them because the instructions say they had to. And then they learn that that's a 10-year with a 7-year mandatory, and they can't believe it. They can't believe it. So hopefully we can decrease the harsher sentences. I'm wholly in favor of modification of the life without parole, in the sense that so there's an opportunity to get out, the look backs to try to undo some of these harsher sentences. But as Al, I think you pointed out, I feel sometimes that we're banging our head against the wall in hopes that it moves an inch. But we got to keep trying. I should stop talking. Questions are better for me.
Well, let's let Larry comment and then we'll go
Sure.
for questions.
I really appreciate to have somebody like Aaron in the system, because he is so important, not only locally, but statewide. And I just hope he doesn't give up, keep fighting. I would say just a little bit about prosecutors. Every person in the prisons in Iowa is there because of a prosecutor. A prosecutor is a gatekeeper for the prisons, and they really, sometimes we don't realize their role and how important their role is, because they make some important decisions in the charging and in the sentencing and in their leadership with police. I was a prosecutor in Columbus, Ohio, a court of over 1 million citizens, and then in a rural prosecutor in Bremer County. And I think there is a difference, but this is common that sometimes people don't realize about a prosecutor. I think the only one and Aaron can correct me on this, that the only one in this criminal justice system that has an obligation to do justice is the prosecutor. And the Bar Association standards that set the standards for prosecutor, and there's a standard 3-12 that says The prosecutor is an administrator of justice, a zealous advocate for the officer of the court, exercise sound discretion and independent judgment. And it goes on to say a prosecutor's duty is to seek justice. Now, nobody else is supposed to seek justice, but that's what the prosecutor's role is supposed to be. And is protect the innocent and the interests of the victims and respect the constitutional rights of all people. Those are in the requirements of a prosecutor that are built in. It's a supervisor advice. It's to seek change if it's appropriate. That's what the prosecutor's job is, to seek change. He knows he or she knows the system, and he knows where there's weaknesses and strengths, and this prosecutor's job is to seek these changes. And the prosecutor has to assist community courts to address the problems of the area. So a prosecutor's job is also to look at the local area and determine what corrections should be made in the area of criminal justice. Prosecutors, and these are all statements from the standards. They're a problem solver, and they should seek reform to improve in administration of justice, and when that inadequacies of injustice and substantial law, they should seek to change it. So it's the prosecutor's really role. But in reality, it's not always the case. The role of the prosecutor doesn't always work that way. I ran across the study, a discourse by a former assistant U.S. Attorney General, who his name is Albert Brick. He's professor of law at Georgetown University. He was a Black prosecutor, and he said he went in to be part of the system, and then he found out that the system had changed him. And so he thinks the prosecutor's role is really the part of the problem of the criminal justice system. And he points to the area of plea agreements. That plea agreements are ways that cause problems in the system. They're a necessary evil in a way. 95% of all cases, that's what statistics seem to show, that result in a plea agreement. And so the prosecutor can overcharge or can multiple charge. And in Iowa, there's 3 strikes and you're out is a tremendous pressure that is used by prosecutors to convict, to encourage people to plead guilty. If you don't plead guilty, I'm going to go after you and put you in for life. And so a lot of people that are in prison and have gone in prison have given up the chance to have a fair trial because they have been forced and been given trouble. It's an important component of the system, but it's also a problem. He alludes to the progressive prosecutors, and those progressive prosecutors, Aaron touched on those a little bit, but and I think they go from Angela Davis wrote a book in 2009 called Arbitrary Justice, the Power of the American Prosecutor, and arguing that the prosecutor should be more active in seeing that justice, and there have been some, these progressive prosecutors, you've heard about them in Chicago and Cook County, that they won't charge offenses, won't charge sex work or drug possessions and lower level offenses, and also in Philadelphia, the prosecutor is required all of his agents to explain to the court on sentencing the costs and benefits of any person that goes to prison, and they have to point that out to the judge in a particular case. And I think it would be a time to point out to the court of the problems with some three strikes laws. Locally, you heard there were 8 urban. There's a great disparity, or there's a difference between rural and urban in Iowa. There are 8 urban areas, and else shown those, but that means that there are 91 rural areas, and many of these rural areas, and like I was one myself, many of these are part-time prosecutors. And in a way, I think that's good because they have more of a touch with the community and more of a realistic. If you'll notice, I think, if I haven't seen the statistics, but I'm sure that by far the majority there of all incarcerations come from the urban areas, not the rural areas. There are relatively few trials in the rural area. In my 12 years as county attorney, I knew there were a couple of judges in our area, a couple of prosecutors in the area that bragged that they never had a trial, and that's kind of an interesting observation. In those small areas, when there is a more serious case, the Attorney General's office is brought into play. And the trouble with that is that we have a new Attorney General, and that Attorney General has done what a prosecutor should not do, align herself with the police. The prosecutors are independent and shouldn't be part of the police. So I think we've got some interesting things that are going to be happening in the next few years because of the change of the Attorney General's office.
Well, thank you, Larry. And I think we of course we had a conference on progressive prosecution last year and learned a lot about that then, about the prosecutor's pivotal role and everything. And of course, the prosecutor, the police deserve a lot of attention for their misbehavior, particularly with regard to people of color. But we need to realize that prosecutor has a lot of influence on police behavior, because if the police get the message from the prosecutor, we're not going to do much on whatever it is, that's an incentive for them to not arrest as many people for whatever that offense is, because why should they bother to arrest if the prosecutor is not going to bring charges? And also in terms of making sure the police have valid evidence to arrest somebody, the prosecutor can decide, well, if the police are careless, not to bring these charges. But yet oftentimes some prosecutors just automatically bring the charges, even when the police have done a sloppy job of actually investigating it. And of course, with plea bargaining, the police evidence may not ever have to stand up in court because they plea bargain it out. And so the interaction between the police and the prosecutors is very important in terms of determining how things are handled. In terms of well, let me get some questions here. Deb, you had your hand up.
So I've had spent minimal time in court, but I have been there as a support person / visitor, and then also reading, this book from the lifers and their experience. It seems to me that the juries are given tunnel vision information. I mean, like, things are not brought into evidence or into the whole picture. I don't know. I don't know what people who are in the courtroom think about that, but that's kind of what I'm sensing.
Aaron, you wanted to respond to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, that is true, and it's absolutely true. And I tell my clients that, especially when we get a packet, it's an investigation. It's not what's going to be in the courtroom. And while I understand as somebody that's an advocate for that, an individual defendant that's facing time or accusations, that might seem like they're hamstrung. Frankly, on the whole, it inures to the benefit of the defendant through the rules of evidence. And so a lot of the work that happens at the beginning is, from a defense perspective, is to prohibit the state from entering evidence that just says this person's a bad man or woman, therefore they must be guilty of this. And so what that does is it limits the amount of backstory that's brought in, because oftentimes our clients can have some bad backstory, but it doesn't mean they're guilty of this particular instance. And so, but that also means that a lot of the story doesn't get told on the defense perspective, because you may have heard the phrase opening the door, that if you go down a particular road from a defense perspective, then you open the door for the state to do the same thing. And so it is in a vacuum. It is true that the evidence is limited to those things that we deem relevant. And oftentimes we're not allowed to put in evidence, for various reasons that we want to put in. But it does happen to both sides. I can tell you that the law rarely benefits us more than it does the prosecution. Okay, but they're on balance, keeping it to the specific issues at hand for that jury to hear. I think, there's a lot of what our work is and benefits the defendant most of the time. I would like that people would know the penalties, frankly. I do think it's disingenuous that when the court instructs them that you're just the finders of fact, you have nothing to do with punishment. That's baloney when you live in a world where the punishment's mandatory if you convict them. Because the reality is neither does the judge. The judge has nothing to do with punishment if you convict somebody of first-degree murder. The legislature said what you're going to be convicted of. So why not tell the jury? Why not tell the jury what a robbery second is? Real quick, this isn't an answer to the question, but in response to Larry, just to be clear, Iowa doesn't have a 3 strikes and you're out that leads to a life sentence like California once did. I don't think that they do anymore, but we do have a ramp up in charges that the more convictions that you have, the worse it gets for you over time. I suppose it's thought to be progressive punishment, but I can't not echo and repeat enough the fact that the one party in this system of justice that receives zero accountability, save an election that's meaningless, is the prosecution. The judges are hamstrung by the law and what the most mandatory sentences and things like that. They're hamstrung because they can't start a case. They only do things if we ask them to. And we are hamstrung because we are dealing with the defendant and the rules that apply to us. But the initial charging decisions, and Larry is absolutely right, the prosecution has wide and varied discretion. They can use it for justice, which they rarely do, or they can use it to hammer people into pleas, which they do often, which leads to the plea bargain problem that was discussed. So I just wanted to chime in on that. Did I answer the question, Deb? I know that I put on the
Yeah,
side.
and I'm going to respond to Karen's question here in a minute, but before I forget, I just wanted to point out that, we've had, we have had in the last couple of years a spike in violent crime in some areas of the country. Okay, that's a reality, and there are all kinds of complex causes for that. But of course, what that's done is given opponents like police unions an excuse to really attack progressive prosecutors and to say, oh, well, no wonder we're having more crime. These progressive prosecutors are soft on crime. I mean, it's total crap, because the causal relationship between the increase in crime and progressive prosecution is dubious, to say the least. The same way with bail reform, the spike in crime, people are saying, it's because we're letting more people out on their own recognizance rather than putting them in jail for bail. I mean, there's absolutely little evidence to show that the people that are being not retained on bail are the ones that are committing these crimes. But as you know, in these situations, emotion counts for more than evidence. So any way that they can, the advocates of a stricter system can use this information to beat up on the various efforts of reform that are happening, they'll do it. Police unions are notoriously, strong opponents of any changes in prosecution. They will use any way they can to beat down any reform efforts. I'm not saying all police officers agree with that, but the police unions tend to be the most conservative elements of police departments. The leaders of the police unions, for some reason, are usually the most reactionary elements of police departments. And
Yeah.
so any progressive prosecutor has to go up against, and I'm afraid we may see that in Des Moines as our new progressive prosecutor there tries to make changes. She's going to be up against a lot of resistance from different people in the community. Karen, you had a question. You're muted.
Thank you. Al, actually, I have a couple comments, and I hope you'll indulge me. First of all, Al, I really want to thank you for your presentation. It's so good to get Iowa data. So often, it seems like the data I get is often national stuff, and I think it's so important for us to look at Iowa specifically, especially if we're talking to legislators. I also want to thank Larry for really emphasizing the role of the prosecutor. That prosecutor has a huge amount of power, often more so than the judge or anyone else in the courtroom, certainly more than the defendants do. And there's a great book called Punishment Without Crime that really talks about how the system treats those individuals who get caught up in it at the misdemeanor level. And, so many of the people in our county jails are sitting there waiting their trials.
Right.
And the prosecutors use that to manipulate them into plea bargains. The bit of data I often use when I talk to people about the problem of mass incarceration in Iowa is this. I remind them that Iowa's general population has been consistent and pretty stable over the last 50 years. It's been probably much longer than that, but we're not a growing county in terms of our state in terms of our general population. In 1971, our inmate population was 1,540 people, 1,540. In 1981, it had grown to 2,670. In 1991, things were getting tough people were starting to get tough on crime there. It went up to 4,077. But by 2001, and this is after all those tough on drugs, tough on crime laws that got passed in the 90s, mandatory minimums, mandatory sentencing, our population then grew to 8,108. And I think we've fluctuated between 8,000 and 9,000 ever since. It's the same general population. And basically, I think our crime rate is, at least for violent crime, has remained the same. But it's been all those things that Aaron talked about, the enhanced sentencing laws, the mandatory minimums, taking away power from judges that have caused our population to quadruple in our prisons from 1971. I just thought that would fit in well right now. I hope you don't mind indulging me that.
Well, I want to get back to you and figure out where you got some of those early numbers because I was having trouble finding much back
Oh.
past about 77. So I want to get back to you on that, Carrie, because I need those early numbers. But so other questions or or comments? Oh yeah, Marilees.
Yeah, so it's not really I want to know how does one help our loved one, like truly help them? Like besides being in this meeting right now, besides signing up for other events and other, other meetings and getting the emails and stuff, how can we truly help? Like I posted about this on we have an Iowa loved one Facebook group that I posted on, and like I got 2 people to like it and stuff. And like, how do we, because I know that there's strength in numbers. How can we help our loved ones really? Like on a case by case, also on a general, like Iowa like group, because I'm actually from Florida. So I live in Florida right now. And I plan on going to Iowa, but I want to help, but I don't really know what else to do besides what I'm already doing.
Aaron, can you comment on that? Because you're dealing with people in the system all the time.
Well, is it Mary Elise? Is that, or did I just did I
It's
get it
okay.
right?
You're fine. It's pronounced
Okay.
Mary Ellis.
Mary Ellis. That's all right. That's all right. People call me Aaron. So that's well, hey, to your point in the chat, sentencings, by the way, that's sort of no holds barred. You can argue pretty much whatever you want in sentencing. Is that the trial itself that is sort of hermetically sealed from an evidence standpoint. Although with mandatory minimums and things like that, sentencings oftentimes are kind of meaningless as well. What I think is that what I would help, because and to Larry's point, and I could speak ad nauseum on it too. The real dropping of the ball, and is the fact that people are not educated about the role of the prosecutor. And remember that is an elected position. Technically, the judges are after they're appointed, but a retention vote is kind of meaningless unless you were an author of the Varnum decision in Iowa. So the reality is that people are not educated in the role of the prosecutor. So if, to me, in our county, if you want to see real change, and in other counties, and I agree with Larry that in rural counties, you don't see it this way. I mean, I practice outside of Blackhawk County. I go there, it's a breath of fresh air. It's like, oh, I can breathe again. Oh my God, you're rational. Thank you that you exist, right? And then I come back to here. The most important thing to effectuate that change in my opinion, at that level, is to find candidates that are willing to run for county attorney. I mean, I understand that they got labeled progressive prosecutors. I think that it would be prosecutors that are doing what they're charged to do along the lines of the standards that Larry outlined from the Bar Association, and are also the standards that are outlined by the Iowa County Attorney's own the association, which says use your discretion not to charge people. Now, I can say this is the time to do it. This is the time to do it. There are 2 pressures right now. First of all, COVID created sort of a backlog in the system, and there's nobody around to be lawyers. The second one that the Iowa Chief Justice Susan Christensen talked about was the crisis and the fact that we don't have indigent defense attorneys. And that is true. And if you don't have attorneys to represent people, then you have to prosecute fewer cases. And so those diversion type things that we were talking about, now's the time to talk about diversion. If you have ideas about diversion programs or ways to keep people out of the criminal justice system, now's the time to pounce, because we are really in trouble with not having attorneys, let alone qualified attorneys, to represent folks.
Aaron, I had a stupid thought, and this always bothered me. There's the law about the speedy trial. And I wonder if everybody demanded a speedy trial, our system would collapse. There aren't enough judges, there aren't enough lawyers. And if everybody demanded a speedy trial, I just wonder why defense attorneys don't do that more often, is demand a speedy trial. And honestly, it would paralyze our courts. Do you agree with that? if
I
everybody-
do. And the problem is Larry, from a defense perspective, our very first and primary and really ultimate
I know.
concern is with the individual interests of our client.
I
And
know.
while, yes, we call it the nuclear option, Larry, we could just bring the system to its knees. But then you go to Johnny and Johnny says, yeah, but I'm working, and I don't want to have to keep yo-yo back and forth to court.
I know.
And it's tough to do. That being said, we're about this close to doing that. Okay.
I mean, with the shortage of defense attorneys, I just think, what in the world? I mean, that means that the charged are going to have that less chance of getting justice.
Yeah. But here's my concern. Larry, is that, yeah, they're going to call for more money for the indigent defense people to hope people get on board. Personally, I think one thing the Supreme Court could do is change the rules for licensure. They make us get 15 hours of CLEs or continuing legal education a year, make every attorney that wants to be an attorney except a judge or prosecutor do 15 hours of indigent defense work. You could do those things. But right now in this environment, if push comes to shove, because I was looking at the history on this, I'm a little concerned that somebody that could use the originalist interpretation of the right to counsel that's in the Sixth Amendment of the US Constitution and Article 1, Section 10 of the Iowa Constitution. Now, our Iowa Constitution would be different. Could be interpreted to mean that the system that we have set up that guarantees you an attorney really isn't necessarily required by the Constitution. That concerns me right now. And that's the blowback that concerns me down the road. So I'm with you. I wouldn't have said that 5 years ago, by the way. I would have never felt concerned about thinking that the right to counsel wasn't sacrosanct. But I used to think that about other rights too.
One comment I wanted to make earlier, but it's just that, the problem that IJAN faces is, as I'm sure other advocacy organizations, is, where to start. And, any organizational person will tell you, don't get too scattered. Don't try to do 20 things at once, because you won't do them all properly. But it's such a complex system that, and there's so many sources of disparities that it's often hard to figure out exactly where you should put your focus, where you should start. I mean, obviously the prosecution system, the so-called front door issues are very, very important, but sentencing reform is also important. If we can get rid of the mandatory minimums for the most part, then that would do a lot to reduce the prison population. So we can start there. I'm always glad to get different inputs on what's the lever that we use here to start to make change in the system, because we want to concentrate our resources where we believe Lauren, I'm sorry. Any advocacy group faces this dilemma, and of course, any ideas or input that we can get on that are welcome. Sue, you had a comment?
Yes, and I believe that the woman who asked the question has a fiance who is a lifer in Iowa. And I just wanted to speak for just a moment about what we can actually do to make change once a person is sentenced and is in the system. As far as lifers are concerned, there are a couple of Republican senators who are interested in changing the age from 18 to 21 for juvenile age, which would mean that the people who were under the age of 21 who are convicted of a Class A felony would automatically then have the right to see the parole board. They would have the right to be considered for parole. And we do have 26 juvenile lifers who have already been released and who are doing very well. And we know statistically all over the country that lifers have a very, very low recidivism rate when they are actually commuted and then gain parole. So I would say one of the things that a person can do who has a lifer incarcerated is to get interested in providing information to legislators about changing the age. And when there's a lot of information out there about that, a lot of reasons to do that. The other thing that we can do to try to help people who are convicted of Class A felony is to work with changing the culpability of accomplices. There are a couple lawyers and there have been a couple bills introduced. They never got anywhere, but they've been introduced. So there is some interest. We had 40 senators and legislators who were in support of changing the accomplice bill, that if you did not actually commit the murder, you would be charged with a Class B felony rather than a Class A felony, which would open you to the possibility of parole after, I think it's 30 years or 35 years. So that I think is important. For what we can actually do is to look at the laws that are out there now about sentencing. We can change mandatory minimums in the legislative area. We can do something about changing the age of juvenile, and possibly we can do something working toward changing the age of culpability.
Yeah, this is very important. Also, our governor has been, not to be blunt about it, rather two-faced on this issue. She started out saying that she wanted to reform the commutation process, and she was supportive of implementing a more considered approach where people that were applying for commutation would get a much more systematic and careful hearing rather than being just sort of dismissed summarily as they'd been in the past. And she helped set up the process, but then she proceeded to ignore the results, because even the people that through her process were highly recommended for commutation, some of them even had the support of their prosecutors and their judges that is sentenced, that charged them and sentenced them to begin with for commutation. She simply ignored all that, and the number of people that she's actually commuted is 0. And so I think continuing to point that out and trying to encourage her to actually respect the process that she set up for this would help, because right now she's basically just ignoring her own process, and she's ignoring the results of her own process. And I don't know how we get her to move on that, but that's just a glaring example of how somebody can talk out of one side of their mouth about reform, but then do the opposite in practice. Marcia, you had a comment or question?
I have a question for the people in IGN. Do you know of any pending bills in the 2023 legislature that relate to criminal justice, or do you know of any thoughts? Do any of the legislators have any thoughts or ideas about what they want to do in this session of the legislature?
We're gonna later on in the day, we're gonna talk about a couple of specific pieces of legislation that are being proposed.
Okay.
One related to probation, and one related to juveniles, fines and fees for juveniles. Then also Representative Bob Kresick has introduced a bill to get the community colleges more involved in education follow-up for people that have been incarcerated. So there are bills out there, and we'll be talking about them today, and also sending out the notices to our people about specific things to talk about, because you're absolutely right. sending your legislator a message saying, we want you to support criminal justice reform. It's
Mm,
not going to
right.
get you very far.
No,
You have to
no.
be specific. Sue has mentioned some of the ideas that are out there and have actually received bipartisan support with about life without parole, the accomplice thing
Right.
and the
Right.
age thing. But unfortunately, even Republican support has not been sufficient to get the leadership off the dime about this stuff. And so that's frustrating. You go out and get bipartisan support for things, and then it doesn't do any good. You know,
Right.
it's like,
Yeah.
but we definitely will be talking later today, and also be giving people an opportunity to write on particular things. There's not a whole lot being proposed right now, but there are
Mhm.
some things out there, and we can continue to remind legislators of things that they can support if they want to. But
Right. Okay.
um,
I would also add to that, that there may be a compassionate release bill that comes out again this year. We've
Okay.
tried that for the last 3 years, but have not been successful.
Mhm.
But that's something to keep an eye on,
Mm-hmm.
compassionate or elder. And we're starting to change that to elder release rather than compassionate release.
Okay.
The wording.
Yeah,
of
the
it.
wording.
So,
The wording
yeah.
can make a difference, right? Yeah. Okay.
exactly, because we don't want to be compassionate in Iowa.
Exactly. They don't. So yeah, we
Heaven-
need to use different
heaven
wording.
forbid that we could have compassion in our criminal justice laws, right?
Right.
Pam, you had a comment?
Well, it's a request actually is when Aaron started talking, he said there's not enough time to talk about trends in Iowa. And so I just wondered if before we run out of time, if there were some important things he wanted to share with us.
Aaron, and we'll see you.
I'm here. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I multitasked there for a second. So Pam, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, you said there wouldn't be enough time to talk about trends in Iowa. Could you share a few of those with us before we run out of time?
Oh, trends in Iowa? I'm sorry if I'm hearing you correctly. Did you say trends?
Yes, trends.
Okay. Well, before you run out of time, all I can say is, let me just say this. Pay, if you want, I suppose this is part of the sentencing reform. Pay attention to the new efforts to criminalize things. Although this legislative session, I do think will be a little bit light in that regard, other than the glaring issue of the death penalty, but hopefully that'll die. The other thing I would pay attention to is this proposed government reorganization
Yeah.
and how that will impact the Department of Corrections, the Department of Correctional Services, local jails, and our mental health system. I would keep an eye on any legislation that comes down related to that consolidation. I would also keep an eye on any rule changes related to the Department of Corrections, related to how people are released and not. We will be seeing some interesting things, in my opinion, in that regard down the road. But maybe we won't. But that's what I would be focusing on from a trend perspective, because I think ultimately the future trends may emanate from the government reorganization, if that makes sense, Pam. So
Just real quickly, what kind of government reorganization are you talking about? What
Well,
ideas are out there?
generically, I can say that, the governor is proposing, I believe, shrinking the number of agencies in the state, number of, there's a consolidation effort under the guise of saving money. And, that'll affect a lot of other areas in state government, but it will also affect our criminal justice system probably substantially. And I will wait, as you all will, to read any legislation that comes forward in that regard. But I have every belief that it's coming forward, and I have every belief that it may have a negative impact on our prisons, community-based services and jails.
Okay, I want to suggest that we just take a real short